Long ago, in the country of England, there lived a young lord by the name Robert of Locksley. Robert's father had had a large estate and castle, and was well loved by the peasants, who were treated fairly and went happily about their work. When Robert's father died, it was decreed by the evil King John, who had taken the throne in the absence of his brother, that all lands and buildings were to be taken from the Locksley family. King John's brother, the true king, Richard the Lionheart, would never have stood for his evil brother's greedy plans. But John and his right-hand man, the Sheriff of Nottingham, had young Robert thrown from his family lands and his father's house, never to return. Young Robert was a law-abiding citizen. He built himself a shack on the edge of the forest and set about rebuilding his life. He would collect firewood and had a small vegetable garden in which he grew potatoes, carrots, cabbages and pumpkin, and eating these delicious fresh vegetables, and by trading in the town for eggs, milk, or occasionally a rabbit, Robert grew up straight, strong and tall. Robert had always been a good archer and had used to go hunting often with his father. But those days were closed off to Robert now. All the animals in the forest, and the fish in the streams, and the birds of the air now belonged to King John's representative, the Sheriff of Nottingham. And to make matters worse, it was decreed by the sheriff that should any man be caught hunting by his gamekeepers, the penalty was death by hanging. Well, our story really starts on the day that Robert walked out into the forest. He had on his best suit of Lincoln green and was looking forward to some target practice down by the old oak tree at the edge of the stream. Robert had practiced many times firing at the dead branches of that particular tree, and this day seemed like any other. Robert pulled an arrow from the quiver on his back, fitted it to the string of his strong birch bow, and drew back, ready to let the arrow fly, when a coarse voice said, "About to kill another of the sheriff's deer, are we now, Locksley?" Robert span around, the bow and arrow still in his hands. "Now put that bow down," said the man slowly walking towards him. "You wouldn't want to end up dead like your father now, would you?" And the gamekeeper laughed loudly through his blackened teeth. "We caught you red-handed, Locksley, and don't try anything with that bow and arrow. My partner Cleve has an arrow pointed straight at your heart. Put your bow down now. We're going to pay a visit to the sheriff. And you know what he does to poachers." Robert knew there was nothing to say. The sheriff would of course take the word of his corrupt gamekeepers and leave him swinging at the end of a long rope if he wasn't careful. He started to put his bow and arrow down, but as he did so, Robert rolled to the right in a kind of half somersault. An arrow whizzed by Robert's right ear, and out of the corner of his eye he caught sight of the second man hidden behind a bush. He quickly drew back his arrow, and whoosh! Robert's arrow flew swiftly through the air, a painful cry indicating it had hit its target. The bigger man with the blackened teeth drew his dagger and rushed at Robert, but he was too slow. Robert threw his bow forward, and the big man came crashing to the ground, his dagger flying from his large bony fingers. Robert picked up the dagger and held it to the gamekeeper's throat. He then said, "I will spare your life, gamekeeper, even though the very ground you walk on becomes corrupt. Go and tell your Lord Nottingham that from this day forth he has made a sworn enemy, and that I, Robert of Locksley, will fight with all my strength to bring peace to the kingdom of good King Richard, and will do so until the real king returns. Tell him also that until peace again exists in this kingdom, and fairness to all men prevails, I shall be known as Robin Hood." And with this, Robin jumped to his feet and disappeared quietly into the forest. When the Sheriff of Nottingham heard this news, he flew into a rage. This was all he needed now, an upstart lord turning against himself and his close friend King John. The sheriff decreed Robin Hood an outlaw, and put a price on his head, to be brought before him, dead or alive. He then called for his servant, Maid Marian, and told her to bring him some more wine. Robin Hood walked through Sherwood Forest for many hours. He knew that from this day forward he would be hunted as an outlaw, but he was comfortable in the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong. Before too long he came to a stream. Across it lay a tree trunk which had obviously been used from time to time as a bridge, and Robin started walking towards it. As he did so, a giant of a man approached the log from the opposite bank. He had a long red beard, brown hair going a little bald on top, and must have stood an arm's length higher than any man Robin had ever seen before. His clothes were tattered and torn, and in his hand he carried a long staff, which was a straight, hard tree branch used in those days for fighting. As Robin put his foot on the tree trunk, so did the giant man. So Robin walked back 2 steps. So did the other man. Robin then held out his hand as if to say, "You first." But the other man held out his hand too. So Robin jumped up onto the log and started walking. But so did the other man, until they met in the middle of the stream. "Out of my way, knave," said the big man, "or I shall knock you into this stream." Robin said, "I have no time to argue with troublemakers. Walk backwards, my oversized friend, or it is you who will be getting wet." "We'll see about that," said the giant, and swung his staff at Robin's feet. But Robin was too fast for the big man. He jumped in the air like a ballet dancer, and the giant lost his balance, falling head over heels into the water. Robin couldn't help himself from laughing. The big man stood up to his chest in water, trying to shake the water from his beard and ears like a big wet dog. "I hope I have made my point," said Robin. "But just to show there are no hard feelings, take hold of my bow and I shall pull you out." The giant smiled and grabbed the end of Robin's bow, yanked as hard as he could, and splash! Robin was in the stream beside him, and only his head was above water. The 2 men scowled at each other, but then the big man said, "My name is John Little, but they call me Little John. I would ask you for a cup of tea, but I'm afraid our matches have got a bit wet." And Robin and his new best friend Little John laughed and laughed for a long, long time. The next day, as Robin and Little John were walking through Sherwood Forest, they heard voices coming from a clearing behind the trees. They both crept slowly to the edge of the clearing and peeped out through the branches. There were 3 men firing arrows at a target some way off. They would take it in turns, 3 arrows each, and were trying to hit an acorn nailed to the trunk of a tree. After each man had had his turn, a rather overweight monk in a brown friar's habit would collect the arrows and bring them back to the archers. In the bushes, Little John and Robin watched for a while, and then they walked over to the untidy group. All three men turned, arrows pointing at Robin. "Do not be afraid," said Robin. "I too am an outlaw living in the Sheriff's forest. You have nothing to fear." As the men relaxed, Robin told them his story. Their leader, and the oldest of the three, was Allan a Dale. The men had all been saved from the Sheriff of Nottingham by the little man who'd been collecting the arrows. He was a monk called Friar Tuck. The sheriff's men had come to sentence them for not paying enough in taxes, and he had helped them to get away. The penalty for tax evasion in those days was to have your right hand chopped off, and because they had run from the evil sheriff, now they and the good Friar Tuck were all proclaimed outlaws. "Well," said Robin, "if the good sheriff has deemed all of us outlaws, then outlaws it is we shall be." And the men set to cheering and throwing their hands in the air. "Wait, comrades," shouted Allan a Dale. "How is it we know we can trust this Robin Hood to be our leader? Why should we put our lives in his hands?" Robin plucked an arrow from his quiver. He aimed and let fly. Whoosh! The arrow split the acorn they had been shooting at clean in half, and it fell to the ground, leaving the arrow stuck in the tree. The 5 men all stood with their mouths open in surprise. Robin quickly fitted a second arrow and let fly. Whoosh! Dum! The second arrow split the first, straight down the middle. Not a word came from the men now. They were speechless. "I believe we have 3 shots each," Robin said, "but I won't waste this one." Whoosh! He let the arrow fly. "Ha ha, Robin, you missed that one by a mile," laughed Little John. But just as he did this, a duck landed dead at his feet with Robin's arrow in its heart. "No, I didn't miss, Little John," said Robin. "I just thought it might be time for us to have dinner." And all the men cheered, for they had found their new leader. Over the following months, Robin and his band of merry men set up camp in a cave hidden deep in the forest. They had a fire with a large tripod set over it and a huge cast-iron cooking pot. There was a large table, and deeper in the cave there were sleeping quarters for the men. Each night the men would sit down to a good meal of turkey, goose, venison, or wild boar, washed down with a mug of ale. Sometimes the men would catch trout in the streams, and they would trade this with the villagers at the edge of the forest for flour, beer, and fresh vegetables. That night at dinner, Robin said to his men, "Comrades, we have come a long way over the last few months, but I swore I would help the poor and the underprivileged until the good King Richard returns." Robin picked up his bow and arrow and continued, "From now on, we shall bear arms against the evil King John and his sheriff. We shall rob from those who are rich and unjust and give to the poor, or any of those that the sheriff has set out to destroy with his unfair laws. Comrades, I propose a toast." Robin picked up a mug of ale with his free hand and held it high, then said, "To rob from the rich and give to the poor." And the men hit their mugs together and all replied, "We rob the rich to feed the poor." And that's exactly what they did. Of course, the Sheriff of Nottingham was being kept informed of the exploits of Robin Hood and his merry men. And to make matters worse, the evil King John had come with some of his best soldiers to the sheriff's castle to tell him that these outlaws were to be stopped. King John called a meeting of the rich lords and nobles of Nottinghamshire and said, "My dear Sheriff, for some time now we have been hearing stories of this Robin Hood. They say that the peasants and poor people of the towns love and protect him, while he steals from my tax collectors and gamekeepers." The evil king smashed his fist down on the table and continued, "It seems that offering a reward has been of no use. And now you tell me that sending even your best men into the forest has been to no avail, and that in fact some of your men have joined this... By now King John was almost choking on his words. "This Robin Hood." The Sheriff of Nottingham jumped to his feet, trying to explain. "But King John, we... "Be quiet," said the king. "You have proven to me that you are not even capable of catching a cold, let alone Robin Hood and his merry men." The king sat down and then said, "Wine! More wine!" Maid Marian, who had been listening to all of this, walked over and poured another glass of wine for the greedy, red-faced king. But as she turned to walk away, he grabbed her arm and said, "Wait a minute, my pretty one. Do not rush so as to leave my side. I see you serve your master well, but perhaps you should be serving me in my London palace. With a girl like you on my arm, I am sure I would feel a good 10 years younger. What say you, my pretty?" Maid Marian did not speak a word. She knew how dangerous the king was, and although she despised him, she dared not annoy or antagonize him under fear of death. The king continued, "Cat got your tongue, has it? Be gone, wench. I'll deal with you later. Leave me and my nobles to make our plans in secret. But remember, I have my eye on you." And Marian left the room as fast as her feet would carry her. When the servants had all left the room and the doors were bolted, the king said, "And now, my lords and nobles, I will tell you my plan. We will send a thief to catch a thief, so to speak. And you, Sir Guy, are a thief. Stand, Sir Guy of Gisborne." And a tall knight sitting on the other side of the table stood up. He looked different from the other knights and nobles at the table. His armour was a little rusty, as was his sword, and some of the jewels were missing from the hilt. There was a sad look in his eye, and from the holes in his deerskin boots to his uncut hair, Sir Guy of Gisborne looked to be the odd man out at this meeting. "Sir Guy," said the king, "you are my thief. You are behind so far in your tributes to me, I am about to abolish all your land, workers, and property of any kind in your possession. What say you to that?" Sir Guy straightened himself and said, "My lord, it has been a very bad year for crops on my lands to the north of Sherwood. The early snows wiped out the summer corn, and a plague of mice took what was left of our wheat crop. My peasants were unable to feed themselves or their children, let alone pay the taxes you demand for tribute." The king just laughed. He said, "Since when has having no money been an excuse for not paying tax? I shall tax the very air you breathe if I so desire. No one ever stops the taxman, and if anyone tries, they will certainly be the sorry one for it. I'm not asking for much, Sir Guy, just everything you have." The king laughed. He then stood up and said, "Sir Guy of Gisborne, I offer you and the people of your manor a reprieve, but you must earn it. I wish you to go alone to Sherwood Forest.
I will give you some 75 gold coins, not too many that you will seem too rich, but enough not to raise suspicion. You will befriend this Robin Hood, and after some time escape and report his whereabouts back to me. When you do this, Sir Guy, I will clear your debt to me, and your lands will be reinstated.
Well, Sir Guy of Gisborne didn't like the king's proposal one little bit, but for the good of his own village folk, he slowly nodded his head. Behind the screen, Maid Marian, who had been listening, tiptoed out of the room. The next day, Guy of Gisborne set out through the narrow winding paths of Sherwood Forest in search of Robin Hood. He did not know it, but from the shady trees beside the road, eyes were watching his every move. Sir Guy sat astride a strong brindle warhorse and had been supplied some new shining armour from the king. His shield carried the cross of St. David, and in his saddlebags the 75 gold coins jingled. As Sir Guy turned a corner in the road, 3 men jumped from an overhanging tree branch in front of him. Sir Guy's charger had been trained to stand its ground, and Sir Guy drew his broadsword. "You dare challenge me?" he cried, and lunged at the nearest of Robin's men. But before he could make contact, whoosh, an arrow knocked the sword clear out of his hand. "Not so fast, Sir Knight," said a man standing on top of a rock at the side of the road. He grabbed a vine and swung down into the road. "There's no need for violence," said the man, taking off his hat. He looked up. Yes, it was Robin Hood. "Your saddlebags are all a-jingle tonight," said Robin. "Pray tell us what business you have with so much coin." Sir Guy said, "Why, sir, should I answer to you? Where I ride and what I carry is my own business. But if you must know, this gold is a tribute due to the king, King John."
"Oh, well," said Robin. "Perhaps this time the king will have to miss out on his gold. There are many far more poor and needy than King John. But let us not turn you away, Sir Knight. Come dine with us in the heart of the forest tonight. Little John, help our friend by turning him backwards on his brave horse. We would not want him to remember the path to our hideaway now, would we?" And a few minutes later, the whole group were on their way back to the camp. When the men arrived back at the camp, there was some commotion going on. Eleanor Dale walked up to Robin and said, "There's something I want to talk to you about, Robin, and I think it would be best if it were in private." Robin said, "Eleanor Dale, meet Sir Guy of Gisborne. He will be dining with us tonight, and has brought a donation to us from King John. 75 gold pieces to be exact." Alan replied, "And what makes you trust this knight, Robin? How are we to know his intentions are true?" Sir Guy was looking at his feet, but when he heard this he said, "Upon my honour, I am a fair man. I care for my fellow man. If there be honour among thieves, I have never seen much of it, so let me be, Eleanor Dale." Robin couldn't understand why Alan had been trying to insult Sir Guy, but rather than ask, simply said, "Let's have that talk, Alan, and while we're gone, men, make Sir Guy comfortable." That night, the merry men had a feast like no other. Roast venison was cooked on a spit, and the ale flowed freely from the old oak barrel. Even Friar Tuck let his hair down a little bit, or what was left of it, because he was nearly bald. Some of the men and their wives from the town, who were loyal to the outlaws, came along, and there was dancing and singing late into the night. As the fire died down, and the men sat around kicking the coals with their feet, Sir Guy, who was sitting next to Robin, said, "Rice. Grains of rice. It was to be rice that I used to betray you and your merry men, Robin." And Sir Guy stood up and emptied his pockets, which were full of rice. "The sheriff forced me to come here and betray you. I was to drop a few grains of rice every so often. Then the king could send his soldiers and follow the trail back to your camp. Your men are not outlaws. How could I ever betray those who show only kindness to others?" Robin stirred the fire with the shaft of an old arrow and said, "Well, I don't suppose you thought the birds may eat the rice?" Sir Guy just looked at his feet as Robin continued, "You see, when Alan a Dale asked me to have a private talk with him, he had already received a message. It was brought to us by one of our friends in the village, who often goes to the sheriff's castle. He said he was told of the king's treachery by a lady of the sheriff's court. Perhaps you know her. Her name is Maid Marian." "Ah, Marian," said Sir Guy. "She is the fairest of all the ladies at court. But I hate to say she is in great danger. She refused to speak to the king only last night, and I fear she may be in danger." Robin threw his arrow into the fire and said, "Enough! This time I have heard enough of this evil king and that greedy sheriff. So they plot and plan, steal and molest innocent maidens, do they? Well, enough, I say. This time they have gone too far. Gather around, man. I have a plan." The next day, Robin had one of the villagers spread the rumour that the outlaws had killed Sir Guy. The sheriff immediately sent out 4 of his best soldiers, and they came back with the news that Sir Guy had certainly died. His horse was found in very bad condition, and some of Sir Guy's blood-stained and torn clothing was found on a briar bush close by. There was a cleared patch of ground that showed signs of a struggle, and Sir Guy's sword lay there, broken in half. The sheriff's men also reported a thin trail of rice leading into the forest. The king immediately sent 50 of his best soldiers to follow the trail and capture the outlaws. He then sat down with the sheriff to talk. The king said, "Well, Nottingham, not only should we have our thieves, but now that Sir Guy has departed this earth, I own his lands, lock, stock and barrel." "Yes," said the sheriff, "I did like his castle." "You may have it." The king stood and walked over to the screen. "But I shall have her." He pulled back the screen, and there was Maid Marian standing listening to them. He grabbed her by the shoulder. "You're hurting me," said Marian, and a voice from the balcony above said, "Pick on your own size." The king spun around, and Nottingham jumped to his feet. It was Robin Hood. Robin swung from the balcony on a rope and landed next to the king before he could draw his sword. But the sheriff rushed forward, a dagger in his hand. Robin span around and ducked the sheriff's thrust, and as he did so, he flicked the rope around the sheriff's ankles and cried, "Heave-ho, Little John, heave-ho!" Up in the balcony, Little John pulled on the rope, and the sheriff was hanging in space, upside down, red in the face, and all the time screaming, "No, let me down! I command you, let me down!" The king held Marian in front of him and said, "Come one step closer, and I will strangle this maiden." Robin drew his bow. The first arrow pinned the king's sleeve to the fireplace. As Marian slipped free and ran towards Robin, he let fly a second arrow. This pinned the king's boot to the floor. Robin drew his dagger, rushed up to the king, and pinned his other arm to the fireplace mantel. He drew his sword and stuck it right down the side of the king's knee boot and firmly into the floor. The king stood there squirming like a pinned butterfly as the fire licked at the bottom of his chain-mail trousers. Just then,
a cry went up at the gate of the castle.
King Richard has returned! Good King Richard is back!
And through the gates and into the castle came the true King of England, with Sir Guy of Gisborne by his side. All the outlaws bowed to the king as he walked into the room. He said,
My good friend Sir Guy of Gisborne tells me my brother has been a little greedy in my absence. Robert of Locksley, please come forward.
Robin walked up to the king and knelt down on his knees.
Robert of Locksley,
Said the king,
I christen you Sir Knight.
and Sir Robin Hood and Maid Marian walked from the room hand in hand.